Have we spoken about Kunk on Earth?
I've not
We
seen
should,
that.
because it's the best show ever
Oh
made.
my god, it might be my favorite show this year.
I love Kunk, and there's a lot of Kunk history as well on.
Yes, just discovered.
That one was on Netflix, but there's a lot of other stuff.
Just discovered Kunk on Britain.
Yes,
Didn't know it existed. It's very, very good. Like,
she is phenomenal.
there's just so much of it so funny, and I know it's in part her performance, and I don't doubt she has creative input, but also the writing team. There's a big team of people that make that show work the way it does, and there's this one bit that just killed me yesterday in Kunk on Britain that was like, Santa, you have to make sure that you're good. That's the way that you get toys from Santa. But that's actually not true, because the good kids and the bad kids get toys equally. It's actually based on if you're poor. Santa judges morality based on the income of your parents. It just killed me. It's so good. And like her delivery's just, oh my god, I love it so much. Definitely
That
one of my
feels
favorites.
very-
It's a Frasier situation, because she was like one character. She was one of the characters on a show called Screen Wipe, which was a Charlie Brooker kind of yearly roundup show, and she was one of the talking heads on that. Diane Morgan playing that character, and obviously just now has spun off into for everyone who has no idea what me and Alanah are talking about, like the kind of. Yeah, exactly. I know. It's she's like basically a fake documentarian who has not done the homework and just shows up, and it's all shot very beautifully, like a classic BBC documentary, but with a host who is genuinely completely unaware of what's going on. It's kind of a modern day Alan Partridge. It's kind of in that kind of mockumentary.
Man, the more
kind
I
of
watch Alan
vein.
Partridge, the more that I've realized how he just influenced all UK comedy. Like,
100%.
oh my god, and it's
100%.
so good. But yeah, she like interviews people who work at universities and have actual credentials and ask them the dumbest possible questions. And I feel like it would only work in the UK that they're all aware that that it's a joke, but they don't try to one up it. Like they're all very deadpan and serious and just answer the stupid questions in a way that's like, well,
Are they real people, or
they
is the
are
entire
real
thing...
people, which is crazy because their performances are like perfect. I'm sure they do a bunch of takes, but I've only seen one of them try not to laugh one time. It's just, yeah.
I
it's
think you'd
super
like
fun.
this, Austin. I think this.
So
would
this
tickle
is-
your brain.
But in other words, it's not like the Sacha Baron Cohen, like the Borat interviews and things, where it's like someone doesn't realize they're being...
No, they would all. They
set
all
up.
know. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's actually kind of nicer than that.
It's not mean-spirited at all.
Everyone's in on the joke. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's when I was in college, I loved that stuff. And then the older I got, the more I was like, some of these are actually quite cruel, because some of these people really are in good faith trying to engage. And while he is a brilliant sort of performer and comedian, like on a crazy level, Sacha Baron Cohen,
Yeah.
I definitely found myself kind of falling out of love with that format pretty aggressively in recent years.
I think, I liked it when I was a lot younger, and then more recently end up just feeling bad for people all the time. Like they don't know.
Particularly when it's people, where the whole premise was a lie, where they're very busy and you can feel their sense of urgency. So then it's just like immediately, kind of hackles raised. And I was like, it's kind of, I mean, how is this not fraud? I mean, when you're like misrepresenting yourself. Again, I don't mean to make too big a thing of it, because I some of it is so hilarious that I have to kind of like,
and also very
kind of like wince. Yeah. Plus he's just so good.
He is very,
It's like
very,
a prank
very
show.
good.
It's much more. Yeah. It's about catching people out rather than.
Right.
Yeah, though a little less
I've seen this
mean-spirited than that,
advertised.
I think.
This is on Netflix.
No, I'm
right?
saying this. Sorry, I'm saying Kunk is not that. But,
Oh, yeah. But I was going to say that I think that like it's not even a mean-spirited prank show, Borat, in that it's like any topic we just get very invested in. God. Because I
Stay
do
your
think
ground
it's
here.
American satire, and it's trying to catch Americans out in that way. Like it's not like it's like YouTube pranks now where people just go into a Target and throw shit at someone, right? Like it's like a
bother
little
someone trying to do
more
a day's
intentional
work, yeah.
than that. But yes, certainly some mean stuff in there. Anyway, hey everyone, welcome to Play Watch Listen. I didn't intro the last episode, so let me remember to do this one.
Does that mean we're still in that episode?
Yeah, technically it hasn't ended until
Never ended?
now.
Yeah.
We're still there.
I'm Alanah, a video game writer. That's
still
Mike
there.
Bithell. That's Mike Bithell. He's a video game director. That's also Mystery. He's a video game composer.
That's your knee.
That is also my knee with my. I
Can you
still
draw
have this
my
big
face
scar
on it?
From my. Yeah, I still have this scar from the motorbike accident.
That
Just
feels
live
like
with me
50
forever.
years ago.
I know, and I still have trouble with that knee. In any case, today I offered a topic, which might be the first time we've ever done that.
That's not true.
Yeah, it might have
Just
happened a
the
few other
first time
times.
Let's
in
debate
years.
that for 20 minutes. Let's just debate that for 20 minutes.
I guess
I
last
feel like
week
that was
technically.
I feel like the first like 30 of these we would kind of
True.
brainstorm, and then we eventually were just like, let's just turn on the microphone and see what happens for an hour.
I think the first 20 of these were just the opening level of Jedi Fallen Order, though.
A
true.
commenter made me laugh quite hard the other day because they were like, "Oh, Troy's too busy because he's still on the train." That's why he couldn't join us last week. He never got off the train.
That's accurate.
Yeah. The topic that I offered
The
was,
way we are all still on the train. Sorry, go on.
and I never got off the bus, which is a Childish Gambino reference that I think about often. The topic that I offered was game direction. I'm sure we've spoken about it before, but this year especially, I saw people confused about how, Alan Wake 2 won game direction at the Game Awards and Baldur's Gate 3 won Game of the Year, which I vehemently agree with. Like, I think that is the right call.
That feels right.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a lot of what is game direction? People don't understand what game direction is and how you can award it separately from Game of the Year. And I think there have been some games this year that have perfect game direction, but aren't necessarily 10 out of 10 games. I would offer RoboCop as one of those. That game has perfect game direction, but a bunch of shit that's not, 10 out of 10 in other areas. But the tone is super consistent. The way that the mechanics feed into the gameplay is super consistent. All of the writing is very, very funny. Even if there's ultra violence, it's just so tonally perfect, and every system that is in that game feeds into every other system in such a complementary way, which I would consider to be excellent game direction. I feel the same way about the Yakuza series. They all have such good game direction that game can pull off having a stupid sex mini game where you have to flirt with people on a phone sex line and pick the right answers, but then also has a plot about a woman who was so traumatized it turned her blind, and that they both cohesively exist in the same absurd karaoke simulator franchise is good game direction. So Alan Wake 2, Mike, have you played a bunch of it now? Did you get around to it?
I've not played any of it yet. I've set myself a thing that I have to replay 1 before I'm going to let myself replay.
You don't need to do all that.
2. I'm gonna though. And I will get to. I'll get to both.
Have you played Control?
Yes.
Because I would recommend Control even before replaying Alan Wake 1.
Really,
Yeah.
that dives into that as well.
It's just fun.
Yeah, I think the only one I've not played was I played a bit of
Quantum
Quantum Break. I don't think I didn't get super far in that one. But yeah.
Also related, James McCaffrey, who voices Max Payne and Alex Casey, passed away this week after a long fight with cancer.
Sucks.
Super sad.
It's too young.
Yeah,
65,
65, I think.
Right?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not
65,
sure.
yeah. That sucks.
Super sad, but also I was talking to some Remedy team about it, and just very glad that he was able to see how much people loved the game. At the very least, this year, people loved it so much and his performance so much. But just glad that he was able to see that. And very thankful for his work. Super iconic. Max Payne's one of my favorite video game characters ever. So
Legend.
yeah. Mike.
Isn't it fascinating how the game industry is still so comparatively young that things like that happening are so striking still?
That we lost Max Payne is a huge deal, yeah.
Yeah, there's because the film industry, if you're a film and TV buff, one of your favorite people invariably will go on any given year, if not several, because it's just been around for longer than any of us have.
What have we had voices in video games for 50,
but
20
yeah,
years? Not
particularly acting, but
20.
really in any capacity, any major director, or it's still pretty uncommon. You at the Oscars, they can easily do a several minutes montage where they rapidly go through, and there's still a bunch of names that invariably upset people for having been left out.
Yeah,
and I think I've seen them do this a time or two, at GDC, at or at some other kind of high profile event, but not for the first 10 plus years of my career, and even then, it's fairly rare, you know. And when you think about like a really high profile name like his,
What was the
who a lot
first
of people
video
would
game
identify.
voice we had? I don't like first
I was
voiced
going to say,
game.
that's probably the.
It's. I think it has to have
isn't it?
been 20, 25 years. 25 probably. First video, because I mean I was playing.
Well, to be clear, I'm also
Banjo-Kazooie's
talking about
child,
like
and it
any
was Grant
role,
Kirkhope.
like you know, like a game director or
True.
a high level like animator, or you know, like for
We've
example,
lost
there's
a few of them. We've lost like some luminaries of like the
Yeah.
arcade and the.
It's
Yeah.
true. No, I'm not. I don't mean to suggest that's not the case. But like for example, probably the highest profile game composer death that I can think of was the one who did the first couple. David Cage, like Beyond Good and Evil. He died. Because what was the one that was after that? That they did, that David Cage did.
Heavy Rain?
Before Heavy Rain is like his big claimed. I guess it was. I think it was Beyond Good and Evil was the one. Heavy Rain was right before Beyond Good and Evil,
You got
right?
Fahrenheit.
Yeah,
Heavy
Fahrenheit.
Rain.
Yeah, because I remember he was not quite able to finish that. Norman, I'm suddenly blanking out, Corbile. And then like Dan Licht, who scored Dishonored 1 and 2. But those were, I think, his only 2 games, really. He mostly was known for the guy that scored the TV show Dexter and a bunch of other television
Interesting.
but yeah, it's fairly rare.
Industry's pretty young.
A fascinating thing that'll become far more normal as the years go by.
And
I
like
think.
we have, can you imagine what's going to happen to the industry when we lose like Miyamoto?
Yeah, exactly.
Like it'll
Or-
really, really, really rock people because it sort of hasn't happened to someone of that scale. Apparently I'm getting like conflicting reports, but the first fully voice acted game was Mad Dog McCree, which released in 1990, arcade shooter.
That was FMV. That one.
Was it interesting? Okay, because something else
that might
also
be-
mentions something using IntelliVoice, a game called Dragon's Lair, which is also an arcade game, but I don't know what IntelliVoice means.
Oh, shout out to everyone else over the age of 35 that just died at the lack of
Sorry.
awareness for Alanah there of what
Came out
Dragon's
before I
Lair
was
is.
alive.
Oh. So Dragon's Lair was an arcade laserdisc game where you played like a knight doing QTEs basically.
Interesting.
Like back in the day, if I show you, it was Don Bluth animating. So if I showed you like an
Oh,
image
cool.
of it, you probably do recognize it.
Let me look it up.
But yeah, no, that probably maybe that's weird then that voice basically happened around the time of like FM because both of those were for FMV games because
Makes
there would
sense.
have been like there was definitely voicing games in the sense of like recordings of like Sega.
This
all
game
that
looks
kind of
awesome.
stuff. But in terms of full voice, which one?
Dragon's Lair.
Yeah, you're about to go down the rabbit hole because that is key. That's arguably one of the first like narrative-driven games.
Interesting. And then wait, they made a movie afterwards? They made a Dragon's Lair movie?
I think they released like it was an animated game. It was like a pre-rendered animated game with QT. Basically, you were watching an FMV of an animation. So I think they then released the animation as a movie as well. I think.
Oh, I
they
see.
Used it in both places.
Wow, cool.
It kind of coincides with Bluth leaving Disney and doing. Oh, was he Fievel? Eventually,
I think so.
Wasn't he? But there was
Yeah.
something else before.
American
that he
Tail, Land
did.
Before Time.
What was the one he did? Secret of Nim. I think that was his big kind of breakout one after he left Disney. And then Dragon's Lair was kind of him dipping his toe into the games world.
Interesting.
Good times.
Yeah. Well, it's way
Yeah,
further
well,
back
I
than I
think this
thought.
pretty satisfactorily explains what game direction is. I feel
Yes.
pretty good about
Yeah, we
what
nailed it.
What's
We
game
got it.
direction? What do you do?
Take credit.
Not
No.
much.
I think
Take credit.
well,
That's good.
Thank you. The speed, you can tell I make that joke a lot. I think actually you kind of nailed it with kind of what when you were describing the some of the nouns and verbs and adjectives you were using when you were describing why it felt right that say Alan Wake 2, one of the directors, right? It's about tone. It's about consistency. It's about kind of it's about plugging everything into each other. Someone described it to me like that the other day. Like, it's basically, how do you plug things in? And I've always used the idea of curation as a shorthand. That I don't do the paintings, but I set up the gallery really well, and I've made sure that you have an experience as you move through that feels consistent, that feels logical, that flows together. You've got all these amazing artists doing everything in a game, but you need someone, or in some projects, a couple of someones who basically make sure everyone's pulling in the same direction.
Yeah.
So it's a creative leadership kind of role. There are other ways of doing it. I use
So then how do some
captains work?
Why do some
Sorry, go on.
No, I love that. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
So it just works because nerds have generally seen Star Trek.
Yeah.
But Star Trek basically is, I would say, probably the best pop culture depiction of what leaders do. In the sense that you watch a captain week to week kind of making decisions, and you've got kind of the Kirk, who's the kind of, I've got 2 or 3 trusted people, but I basically go my own way. You've got Picard, who's let's have a meeting, and gets everyone in the room together. You've got Cisco, who's got a vision and doesn't really care what anyone else says and is going to fucking go for it because he knows it's important. You've got Janeway, who's putting out fire. You've got all of these kind of
Janeway, who doesn't need the team
throughout that franchise. This works as an analogy because I know Kirk's and I know Picard's, and I know Janeway's, and I know Cisco's, and I think it's the core problem you're always trying to solve is bringing together everyone's work, making sure that it feels like a consistent single piece, and being in charge of creatively owning and leading that aspect of it. And then different directors have different backgrounds or different layers of interest, so those parts of the game, they may take more of a hands-on approach. So with me, for example, I come from graphic design and game design, so I'm very much in the room with the design stuff. I'm very annoying with the UI stuff and graphic design in general, and I write stuff as well. So it's but then there's other directors who come from a coding background, so they're focused on the innovative stuff on the tech side, or you've got that would be an example of
Matt Nava is an artist through and through, visual artist.
Yeah,
he was the art director.
And you see it time before. And again, different, and you can kind of point to Sam Lake is obviously a big, and Kojima as well, big film nerds. So you can see a lot of that influence kind of come through. And then that all gets channeled through the kind of the auteur reading of stuff, where people kind of attribute certain qualities in the work to an individual. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it is that individual driving it. Sometimes it's just that person has a particular collaborator or collaborators that they like to work with. So there is a look to Hideo Kojima characters, but is that Kojima, or is that because he keeps working with Shinkawa?
Sure.
That's those kind of, but he does keep deciding to work with Shinkawa. So there is some kind of ownership there. So yeah, anyway, it's about curation and about bringing together a bunch of people's work into a cohesive vision.
Yep.
So I agree with you. Alan Wake feels like it's that.
Fantastic game direction.
And to be fair, most of the Remedy games do. They feel like a very consistently pulled together vision.
And I think the reason it stands out,
feels sprawling and massive and impressive, but I see the hundreds of people there,
I think it's also
and that's what that draws to.
Baldur's Gate 3. Again, it was my game. That game's fantastic. Was my game of the year.
Incredible.
If you compare it to Alan Wake 2 in terms of game direction, it does what it sets out to do absolutely perfectly. But Alan Wake 2 is so distinct in terms of tone and style. It is like nothing else in the choices they've made. And the only way those choices can actually make a cohesive, enjoyable experience, the very bold, very creative, there's a goddamn musical sequence inside of it. It's just shocking how creative it is with very distinct game direction. Whereas it's not like Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't have good game direction. I don't think it can stand out as much with a game that's not making very absurd choices. That's why I also use Yakuza as a really good example. Or the RoboCop example of, I think that game has such good game direction, is because it's so tonally specific. It's very, very 80s. It's very violent, but also super humorous. And yeah, literally all of the systems, including even your level up mechanics, will just feed into this same really cohesive thing in a super impressive way. And it's hard to wrangle that many people. Game direction's certainly not an easy thing to get everything on the same page. I think it almost requires very specific choices to stand out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can kind of see the director, right? That's sort of what we're saying. It's like if you can see the director in it, it's probably got good game direction. If it has the personality
I
of
think
someone.
the things you say, tonal consistency, which was something you mentioned with RoboCop, like that's what's interesting and why that's interesting. I can't remember if I said this on the show or after one of our recordings, but that's what's fascinating to me about working on licensed games is licenses kind of help you as a director because there's a lot of rules already set up, so you kind of can be consistent. Almost not quite by default. It requires a bit of work, but there's a north star for you to be.
I mean, especially if everyone's seen RoboCop, they know what it is. it's slightly easier.
So and that's not to diminish anything that RoboCop achieves because it achieves a lot. But there is a support there, and that's definitely something like working on Tron stuff is a lot. I'm making arguments to what I think is good, but I'm also making arguments towards what the franchise is, and that does. The franchise acts as a co-director a little bit, and it's an interesting kind of aspect of that.
Yeah. You mentioned that it's like being a creative director, but some games have a game director and a creative director. What does that mean? What do they do?
So I don't fully. That one, Austin might be better placed to answer because of the and you, of course, you.
I have the perfect answer, but I'm trying to throw it to somebody else.
I think it's from my understanding. I'll give the outside perspective. I'll give the ignorant outside perspective, which is game director is focused on the experiential elements of the game, and creative director is largely focused on the aesthetics and aesthetics including audio and sound and the vibes. That's my understanding. Tell me where I'm wrong on that.
Austin, do you have any? It's not common.
Yeah, I've had experiences with both. Most of the projects I've worked on had a single creative director, but there are games where sometimes it's divided based on kind of along the lines where there's like game director is seemingly shorthand for gameplay, which is very much about how we unify mechanics and the actual player experience from almost a technical level. But it's obviously not just technical in the sense of bugs or engineering or something like that. It's this whole cloth look, but without having to also spend just as much time thinking about the narrative and the aesthetics and the more kind of surface facing part of it. Obviously, the success of a game, especially if you're talking about a game at a huge scale, is on those people's ability to be in sync with each other, because the player doesn't really ideally experience them separately from one another, even if you'll see that, or if reviews will be like, well, the gameplay was great, but the story was crap or whatever. Like that it is fairly easy, I guess, to disentangle them. But like I remember on Assassin's Creed, for example, I'm pretty sure there were more than just those two, because if memory serves, it was essentially like a gameplay director, a narrative director, obvious other art director, like art director, that sort of thing.
On the same level, because usually you'd have like a narrative director and an art director that would be below game director.
I don't think so, although because of the nature of the way they were set up, all things audio were delegated to the audio director, who was my main person that I dealt with, and so I didn't interact much with the folks above her. There was also even more senior level, like brand director, who would oversee multiple Ubisoft studios making multiple AC games, and their job was to make sure that everything seem to gel from one game to the next. So there's all these different sort of checks and balances of folks going, does this cohere? And given the scale of it, it's a miracle it works at all, because just the scale of what's being attempted there is so insane.
But that's also never part of the narrative, right? With directors, like the coherence thing is, whenever I say that to someone who doesn't work in games, that's like it's both a revelation, but it's also like really, they kind of act like, well, that just sounds like you're in middle management. It's like, yeah, kind of like that, like ultimately that you're the glue that kind of pulls everything together. I think we have this idea of directors being, from the imagination of the visionary director of blah, 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 like, and actually no cohesion ultimately. Like, we are gluing things together, and and you're basically judged as a director on your ability to put a bunch of good people in a room and then make their work coordinate and work together. That's the job.
Sorry, so Alan Wake 2 is co-directed. I thought it was just Kyle Rowley and that Sam was creative director, but from what I can see, it was Sam Lake and Kyle Rowley, who both directed Alan Wake 2. Because I know that...
What was your answer to the question?
So very similar to what Austin said, which is one is more systems and one is more tone. But they still have to work together and have a partnership. And Santa Monica Studios is in a really unique position where Corey, I think, was credited as creative director on God of War Ragnarok, but he's actually franchise director, is one of his various titles, which I've never heard of existing in any other studio, though I'm sure it does, which means that...
Definitely Ubisoft has that.
Franchise.
So, like, obviously when we're working on the God of War TV show, but then also working on God of War Ragnarok, but then also working on God of War Ragnarok Valhalla, the DLC that just came out, and that has, without any spoilers, like references to the earlier God of War games that also Corey also worked on, of course. It's sort of his job to make sure that the whole franchise doesn't fall apart, like a franchise overseer, which I can't even imagine how stressful that is for Corey. It's a lot because it's so the franchise is now so big too, that, you know, there are books and comic books and there's so much God of War content that, yeah, his job is making sure that the franchise always makes sense, and touches on the right things at the right time. And he's also probably more aware of like a future pipeline than anyone else who works there really is, of like what else is coming before they tell the rest of the stuff or whatever. So it's franchise directive. It also, I think in his case, is very closely tied to creative director anyway, because he is overseeing the entire tone of God of War, which again, I'm sure exists elsewhere. I just never heard of it before. And I can't even imagine how awful that job is. But yeah, essentially, one half is... And that's not to say that game director, because our game director for God of War Ragnarok, you know, he still had a huge amount of input on the story. It's not like he didn't touch those parts. Like, it was still very much his baby. I guess creative director in my head is just more tonal consistency. But it's got to be so flexible as well. Like,
they all are. And also, if I can do one of my favourite rants, which is the games industry needs to stop stealing words from the film industry without knowing what they meant in the film industry beyond a director's commentary. One of the biggest issues we have, one of the pathetically
we got some
issues we have. We've got some issues, some real issues that actually impact people's lives. But the one that annoys me, so a lot of what you're describing with like a franchise director, that's just a producer in the film industry. And it's a really interesting split that we kind of use producer to mean
person who makes sure people
often
get things done.
Yeah, and that's kind of that is one kind of producer in film. That's like a line producer.
I wouldn't have thought that was a producer in the film industry. I would have thought
in terms of ownership of a franchise, in terms of the stuff you're describing, in terms of like making sure everything at a franchise level or a brand level ties together. Yeah, that's generally producers. Generally, that would be so. It's
like Kevin Feige is essentially executive producer.
Feige would be a perfect example of this. Or like, you know, when I don't think I'm talking stuff I shouldn't talk about, but like a lot of the people I work with at Disney are producers. There is no...
Interesting.
I'm going to just stop myself before I say something I shouldn't say.
Go ahead.
But like, there's...
But I was going to say, like...
Producers tend to be the people who own this stuff.
Executive producer is the person who does the money in a lot of cases in film.
Executive producer is both the most important person on the team and the least important person on the team in most film projects.
But I'm making another short film in probably March, and I asked a friend who's a producer to help with producing it, by which I mean, effectively, I don't know how to make this. Tell me what I need to do to make this.
That's a kind of producer as well. That's a kind of producer as well, for sure. But I think that's the thing for me because we've elevated in the industry, and I know in film it's definitely also there's 5 different meanings to every word as well. Like, this is not unique to us. But I think the games industry jumped on the word director very quickly because Spielberg's cool and more people have heard of Spielberg than have heard of Bruckheimer. Like, by definition. I feel like
director makes sense. We maybe misuse producer.
Oh no, director makes perfect sense. My point is we call a lot of jobs director. We call there's a lot of things we call director that you would actually... that maybe there would be better terms for.
But we also have a unique problem of... not a problem, it's not a good way to put it, but uniquely to film, you work on a film and you're contracted to work on that one film, and not a lot of these people work full time. Feige being an exception, obviously he's a full time employee, but like a lot of films, it's just a group of people one time and they're not. We kind of have to have a structured hierarchy so that people still have room to be promoted. Like there has to be
That's
like
true as
a
well.
pipeline of jobs that keep going higher. You end up being a department director, art director, cinematics director, whatever, because you kind of, to keep people in a team, you have to give them a place to go.
Well, we also have brilliant things in the games industry, like the principal, where you have someone like where you can take people at a certain point in their career in the games industry and go, do you want to be in management or do you want to keep doing the thing you're really good at? And there's kind of two available paths, which is exactly what you're talking about. That kind of it pulls into that as well. What's interesting actually is, and this is based entirely on publicly available information. There's Marvel. One of the reasons Marvel was able for a decade to get out as much product as they did was that they were run more like a games company, in the sense that they had a lot more full-time members of staff. They had kind of a core art team who would basically be doing the development, the R&D, the development, the pre-production stuff on the whole franchise at once with a standing team. So like the guy who did the concept art for Iron Man was still there.
Makes
8
sense.
to 10 years later in a full-time job. That's how you get that again.
It's the only way they can pull off what they did. I think like Endgame is such an incredible feat that nobody else would probably ever pull off again, right? Like that's really the only way you can do that, is if it's all the same people for as long as possible.
We've been talking about film for about 10 minutes without asking Austin, who works frequently.
Actually works in film.
Yeah. Austin.
All this fuzziness of terms is everywhere. For example, in film, the director is in most cases very much the buck stops with them. They are the final decision maker on most things, but it also depends on the film, because there are producers who control the money that often will have an enormous influence. Even if you hate it, it often will be laid at the director's feet, even if it was due to producer meddling. And then in stark contrast to that, you've got television, where directors are far less influential.
That's the showrunner is director,
the
right?
Showrunner is the person who is, exactly, who kind of owns the creative vision from this as high level view as possible. But there's also variety other than that, because there's a classic tradition of whoever directs the pilot is kind of influent. Like, for example, famously, Frank Darabont directs the pilot of The Walking Dead, and kind of set the vision and then walked away. And
I know studios do that intentionally sometimes, where they'll like hire a big name director to shoot the
100%.
pilot, so that every other director who comes in has that to follow already.
Yeah, they're banking on some more auteurish type to kind of like help create a template for the machine to then be able to duplicate for year after year after year. So that's one model. And I like personally how in games there's like a class of people that are the director level folk. Like when I was working on Lego Fortnite, there would be, I'd get the audio director would come back and say, well, we just had a directors meeting, meaning all the various director, like audio director, gameplay director, art director, the overall creative director, they would all have like a kind of council of the ring, and go through what needs to get done and then disseminate that information to their respective departments. So like Eric, our creative director on Lego Fortnite, he actually
congratulations, by the way. I didn't even know you were working on that. It's so huge.
It's been crushing it. Yeah, I've been absolutely delighted that it's been as well received as it has. Epic really pulled off quite a feat on just like dropping a whole bunch of new stuff kind of all at once, and pretty much all of it seems to have gone really well. Yeah. But like, so our director Eric, he took a particular interest in the music, and so we had a lot of meetings with him, and we would do playthroughs of the game where he would talk through kind of the vision behind certain things, and was involved, even though technically my boss was the audio director, and like everything funnels through him. Whereas like on Assassin's Creed Syndicate, I met the most senior level, like creative director and the narrative director and those folks. I met them kind of at the beginning. I visited the studio and shook hands with everybody. And then we kind of high-fived at the end when I visited the studio again to like go through and do bug fixing and stuff with them, and like a few traded emails here and there. And then like at E3. But otherwise, I was daily talking to the audio director, where they delegated to her to such a degree that like she would sort of encourage me to make polarizing choices, and would be like, that's for me to deal with, not for you if anybody pushes back or whatever.
Is that
like
unusual?
Syndicate was unusual in that way, insofar as I was encouraged to be so against type for the rest of the brand. Like if you listen to Assassin's Creed Syndicate music compared to basically all other AC games, it's really quite different. And part of that was my pitch, but then part of it was Lydia, the audio director, who had said at the very beginning, like, we want you because we want something very different. And then I was like, are you sure? Like, I kind of assumed that was a bit of a platitude. And so I started to deliver different, assuming I was either going to be redirected or fired, and somehow neither of those things happened. But I will say, just to make a point about kind of the director role, about conceptually what they do, no matter which kind we're talking about, that notion of cohesion, just to give a little bit of an insight into how that looks from my angle. And what I love about great directors is there's this common talking point in games and in film and everywhere when dealing with composers, where the person who's on the other side of the table as me is like, I don't know how to speak music. I don't know how to ask for what I'm looking for. I don't know how to, if I hear something I don't like, I don't really quite know how to tell you what I want to change. Like, it's a common, everything, you hear this, every single director all the way up to huge, like DreamWorks and Pixar, they all say the same thing. And so every composer has kind of their ways of getting around that. A classic one that many of us use is, we'll say, talk to us like we're the actors. You don't necessarily, like, directors are taught, don't line read for the actors, or don't try to kind of overly micromanage, but try to explain to them the goal of the scene, and then let them figure that out. If you basically use the exact same language of the composer, then you'll likely get results that will work, because it's our job to sort of translate what that means. But one of the reasons I bring this up,
because in a lot of ways you are also you're like the music director, sort of, not audio director, but like your job is so singularly creative, and no one else really would often know how to even do it. You're sort of a music director.
Everyone, right?
True, I guess other departments don't know about writing.
Danny Boyle calls it the little director approach, which is what he does. So Danny Boyle, film director, obviously, he refers to he calls them his little directors, and it's not patronising.
It sounds a little patronising.
With a British accent, it's fine.
My little directors.
My little directors. You're over there. I don't know why I'm doing a British accent.
You're not very good at that.
No, I'm sure. But like that idea of like that, that's how you respect people who work for you, is you give them authority and autonomy. The music thing is funny, because I definitely have said that to you, Austin, when we work together. I know that's something I've said to you for sure, is because I think I've said it to everyone. But I think that's the kind of the director whispering, that kind of upwards management, is something that I think everyone.
That's why hiring's so important.
The really great people are very good at doing that.
Hire people you trust, directors. And then.
Well, but also people who work for a director knowing how to communicate with the director. That's a skill in itself as well. And I think, weirdly, composers, I think, generally among the best, because they jump around as much as they do. Austin has worked for more directors in his career
than we ever will.
Yeah.
I need to go blow my nose. I will be right back. I really have to blow my nose.
Composers are amazing at that.
I think part of it also is that in both games, but especially in film, there's a certain sense of the director on some level or another could do most of the jobs that they hire others, but who are better at them than at those jobs. Now, gaming, this breaks down a little bit, because there are, like Ken Levine is not a programmer, for example. So I don't think he is. He comes from, theater and writing background. So so it's not a perfect thing. Whereas in film, it's not that uncommon that, you have someone who, if push comes to shove, if you lock them in a room with a camera, they can shoot, they can write, they can edit, they can even act, and maybe not well, but they understand it. Yeah, exactly. But music is almost always the outlier. You know, like you see a lot of the I mean, even looking at like Thomas Was Alone, or like Andy Schatz making Monaco, you know, like
still needed a composer.
It's one of those where there's a huge slice of the game that is 100% delegated, and the rest is like mostly shouldered by the Mike or the Andy of that situation. The little tip I was gonna bring up as, you know, something that I've picked up on the last number of years that I always encourage young composers, but I think this applies to literally anybody who's kind of trying to learn that director whisperer skill, is I always say, just basically try, in the spirit of that initial point that was made a little bit ago about cohesion, look at how the other elements of that have been directed and use that as your main direction. Because while there are cases where occasionally the director is like, okay, so we've made this very high octane, very kinetic, you know, very rapid fire, kind of very colorful, flashy video game. And in contrast, deliberately, we want the music to be very slow and meditative, as that's going to be the interesting thing. That's a relatively uncommon thing. Normally, I'm looking at it and going, okay, I see. So the mechanics are starting to line up as, you know, moving with this general sense of rhythm. The art direction has this kind of general sensibility to it. What can that tell me about the music, so that they don't even have to sit there and go, well, I'm kind of picturing something that's very metalish, or I'm picturing something very like old school symphonic orchestra or whatever. In film, this is in a way a lot easier, because in post, the film very closely resembles its actual self. So I'm always looking at the two main things. How did they shoot it? And how did they direct the actors? Because the same page of script can be shot, you know, big wide angles, super open, or like tight claustrophobic, same lines, but it's so emotionally different viewed through those different ways of shooting it and lighting it and whatnot, that it will inform the music before the directors even open their mouth. So I'm always going to analyze those choices that they've made up
but you're
to
doing,
this
you're
point.
doing a little bit of the director's job there, which is great. Like, and something I remember from working with you, that you are probably the most curious about what else is being done on the project of any composer I've worked with. And that's a great thing, to be clear. That's a cool thing.
I think that's partly in service of working out what the music needs to be, but also it's just because it's cool.
That's who Austin is as a person.
That's who. And that's
it's
true.
Just
yeah,
interesting.
Yeah.
You know?
Try and not let Austin get interested.
Not be curious. Yeah.
Just give it a go. Yeah, but like I think that's something that
I'm
you
like
bring to
Phoebe.
the table
What
that's
else do
really
they put
strong.
gas in? Yeah, no, I always encourage that. I always say
You're very good at that.
It's interesting. Like, in anything that you studied, did you have to learn about filmmaking? Like, for you to pay attention to, you know, the way something is shot and what kind of lens evokes what emotion, are you doing that from a like totally subjective, like opinionated standpoint, or did you have to study that?
It's mostly just that. Because most of my friends were always the filmmakers, like, it's one of these self-fulfilling things. If you like hanging out mostly with game developers and writers and actors and producers and editors and filmmakers and game developers, basically, it's going to be probably a little easier to build a career as a composer in that field, because your social circle is filled with the people that either will hire you or know people that might want to hire you. Whereas
and we'll be having chats down the pub about the things you need to learn and you're about to do that job.
So then it's just to me, it was always just a completely unplanned organic byproduct of who my friends are, where it's like, hey, so what did you do today? Oh man, well, we had this crazy bug with our animation system, but it was the coolest thing when we realized what it was doing. And so then you suddenly find yourself in an hour-long conversation about just how they make their craft, not because I'm trying to learn it for purposes of my professional interest. It's because this is my friend and what's going on in their life, and I care about them as a person, and therefore I'm interested in what's going on in their life. You know what I mean? So it's like these things have second order effects that are professionally beneficial, but that wasn't the main motivation. I mean, like, for example, there's a film director named Amin Matalka who I've done a few features with and who I met when I was a student, and he was a student at the American Film Institute doing his master's in directing. And this is someone who, you know, we would go to movie theaters once a week and for 10 years, you know, and constantly watch things and sit there at the, you know, the arc light after it was over, and he would say, "Oh my God, did you notice that shot where then," and we would just unpack it, especially from his angle as a director and why he was so in awe or what he didn't like about it or that kind of thing. And you just learned so much by proxy, but this is just because he was just a friend, you know. So that's, but I do nonetheless encourage it for professional reasons of folks, especially just getting started, because it's helpful. It's a good way to put everybody's communication on the same page, so you're not talking past each other. And I would think that this applies to all disciplines. Like, from your angle, Alanah, writing, the more you actually understand how games are made, the more you can actually do that job. I would just assume that's intuitive, right?
I mean, yeah. I can't give my actual answer to that question. But it is important to me, obviously, to
just work in the generalist sense. I'm not obviously asking from
there's something I would love to say, but I can't.
I want to hear that answer after we start recording, for sure.
My answer is, in the vaguest way possible. No, I'm not even going to do it. Obviously, for my job, I have to work really closely with other departments, and they inform the things that I do, and I inform the things they do. So yeah, you like it, and that's like one of my favorite parts of the job is like getting to talk to level design about whatever thing they did, and it's super fun and super rewarding, and I think surely the more you know the people that you work with, which I guess we keep coming back to, even more so than understanding the discipline. Like, I don't know how to design a level, but I know how the people that I work with do that, and that I think makes everything in terms of pipelines just a lot easier and smoother and easy to follow.
Intellectual curiosity is like the most important trait I look for in interviews.
It's the coolest thing about game development.
I want to be friends with. It's the best thing. Like, being excitedly interested in how everyone else does their jobs, and respectful, but excitedly interested is ultimately all this is. I think I've probably made this joke before on the show. Like, I'm just the first person who gets to see everything.
Yeah.
And have an opinion, and that's ultimately my job, and that's amazing. So yeah, and that's the angle to take.
Yeah, I think you'd have a lot of trouble being a director if you didn't have that yourself too, right? Like, you have to.
Oh, I've met intellectually incurious directors.
Really?
100%. Like, it's more your auteur. I'm going to tell everyone exactly what to do, and they must do exactly what I say.
And I guess some of those projects do work. Like, it's not like they don't always, but
if you have a strong like if you're an arsehole and very clever, it can work, but you don't tend to be very popular.
Yeah.
I would be hard pressed to name any project that I've ever worked on with a director like that actually then turned out well, or at least was not very obviously hampered in some, like, this would have been so easy to fix if only they'd.
I think it's easier on small teams, and that's why I get my back up a little bit when I've seen discourse happen where it's been kind of, bad working environments only happen in AAA. That will go round indie circles every now and again. It's like, no. There's definitely like indie teams that where people have been treated very badly by these kind of directors. So I think it's easier on smaller teams for the exact reason you said earlier, Austin, of like. In film, and I think in indie it's very true as well, that like if the director is someone who could theoretically do most of the jobs that are happening within the team, then that can lead to very inflated ego where people.
I guess an example of a director
on
a
name and shame though, obviously.
Well, a director on an indie team that stands out to me, that I think had that reputation would be Steve Gaynor, who that
was the name I thought you were about
to
say.
Who, like, to be clear, I was very good friends with, and did not know about anything that happened at Fulbright, but that story did come out, and I guess the story was along the lines of like Steve, who they made Gone Home very famously, was, I don't want to like painted incorrectly, but I feel like it was painted as an almost sort of abusive director. But the games that Fulbright made wouldn't show that, I wouldn't have thought. They obviously had production struggles in the end as a result of that environment. I don't remember. I think it was Open Roads was the last game that they were working on, and it became very difficult to make. But I don't know the
believe that's still in
timeline.
production. I think the team are still building that. But yeah, I think that's true, or at least it was a little while
I'm
ago.
almost certain I saw a trailer for that recently.
Yeah, I think that's still happening, just without
And
Steve.
again, I think that probably is a thing that happened as a result of even calling that poor direction is maybe not even the correct way to put it. But you wouldn't have seen it in the previous two games that Fulbright made, which I think is very interesting. Like Gone Home is so beloved and so critically acclaimed. Maybe it wasn't there at that time, but that's the one that stands out to me probably more than anything of something that I remember happening. And
I always it's always tough to evaluate these things from the outside.
For sure.
just trying to think of an example.
I remember hearing a story once. I'll keep all the names out of it, but this is from the film industry anyway. But there was a pretty big director who was meeting with composers for a film and meets with one guy, and he says, I think it'd be really cool if it was like very metal, like big orchestra, but like electric guitars. And the composer said, yeah, I caution against that. It's really easy for it to quickly just sound like WWE. And I don't think that's probably what you're looking for. And director goes, okay, well, anyway, I'll be in touch. Then calls said composer's agent and goes, your client is such an arrogant piece of shit, and like lost their mind over and it's one of those where I heard this story from the composer, who obviously did not get hired for this film. Who they were bewildered that they apparently came off as extremely brash and arrogant when they were offering what they thought was a helpful suggestion. And I remember hearing that, and I go, there's probably 5 versions of this story, and none of them are quite definitive on who was kind of like hackles raised the most, or who felt their ego most challenged. And I'm not trying to make this as any kind of direct comparison to the Steve Gann. I don't know what happened. I remember vaguely reading about it. I don't know.
It was
any
2021
there.
that all came out, I think. And
Yeah,
it's been a while.
I don't know. I've met him, but I don't know anybody else in that circle or anything. So I'm not trying to make any kind of comparison or anything, but I'm just saying it was fascinating to hear how insanely one-sided it came across for such a, kind of for such a statement where I was like, I think some people in cases like that, particularly if they have huge egos, they just hear whatever, no matter what you say, they will hear it a certain way.
Yeah.
And that those kinds of folks can be geniuses, but they just tend to not be great directors.
It's a filter. The best advice I got was really early in my first lead role. I was a lead designer, working for some other people, and the best advice I ever got, it was basically like, you get to decide, in a lead role, you get to decide basically, are you going to be the filter on the quality of the work by basically having to make every decision yourself, because then you're ultimately, you can't make anything better than you. You are going to be the limiting factor. You're going to be like hitting the top of your graphics card. Like, there is a finite amount of power there. If you decide to be if you go down the curator route, if you become someone who tries to empower the people around you, you can make stuff that's better than you could do on your own. But that requires giving up ownership. That requires giving up that egotistical kind of mentality. And I definitely kind of had to learn that lesson. Like, fortunately, I had time to learn that before Thomas was alone, which meant that when Thomas was alone did well and I could hire people, I had that kind of attitude from basically being told off for being a bit of an egotist early on, because it can be very dangerous to be kind of someone who can only make things that if you're just instructing other people to do things that you would do yourself, then you're ultimately limiting yourself to that capacity. And
I mean, it's like look at the Stark A/B comparison of Spielberg, who I'm either paraphrasing or quoting as essentially saying, my goal is to be the dumbest one in the room, is to surround myself with all these people that hold on.
Holding on. Don't tell me you weren't recording.
Right as I said, hold on, it stopped, and I've restarted it again.
Okay, great.
I don't really know what made it stop. That was weird.
Spielberg's team have just parachuted
yeah, exactly. So Spielberg reportedly, very much will defer to folks. But then you have like Tarantino, who is like exerts such extreme control over so much that and you can feel it in the aesthetic of his films. They're extremely consistent, where you're like, only he could make these. And there was even a quote recently.
Doesn't
he
he not
like,
even do scores? He because he wants to pick the music. Crazy.
Yeah, and there was an interview where he was like, I don't want to trust some composer, like some person who comes along and just puts whatever in the movie, and you just stuck with it.
It's like Hateful Eight, where I didn't realize, I bought the vinyl of it the other day. The Hateful Eight soundtrack is just, I thought it was original music, but it's all music from old westerns, right?
Yeah. No. Hateful Eight is the one and only exception, and it ended up winning an Oscar for score, which is the most brilliant irony of it all. But
cool. Okay.
That was Ennio Morricone, who was like his idol, who he worshipped. And
I thought that was also using Morricone tracks from earlier films. No?
It did do that as well, though. There are bits. There are so. Morricone wrote a score to the John Carpenter movie The Thing that got thrown out and was not used, and
that's what I'm getting confused with.
Tarantino used big chunks of The Thing.
A score for The Thing? That's hard to even picture.
It's totally
speaking
different.
Speaking of auteurs who like control over their soundtracks, John Carpenter is an excellent example of that.
And that's also a study of producer meddling. I'm pretty sure the reason why Morricone was hired was like, okay, you're making a slightly bigger budget movie, Mr. Carpenter, you need to hire a real composer instead of just whatever keyboard stuff you do in your bedroom. But they ended up not using really any of it. And so the unused music from The Thing is a huge chunk of what's in The Hateful Eight. Although, to be fair, the vast majority of it, including like if you watch the big, like roadshow version and stuff, it opens with this 10-minute overture and all that. That is the actual score. It was written for Hateful Eight. I just remember my favorite scene in the film was where they drink the poison and they start like vomiting the blood everywhere and they're tripping in their own. And I remember thinking the music was such an inspired choice for that scene. And of course that was music from The Thing. And I was like, damn it.
You can't judge too harshly because me and you have done the thing we're describing here, where I used an unused piece of music from one project for.
That's true.
Oh, really? No way.
I did.
Huh. That's fair.
The North Star Rising was the COVID radio sci-fi radio comedy thing we did, and the music for that is this is you put this out there. It was your Star Trek.
My unused Star Trek.
No way.
Pitch.
That's awesome.
I was listening to that and I was like, this is really good. This should be in something. And then we
That's really cool. Wow.
Works really well.
Yeah, so it is. It is. Those things do happen. It is. I heard one recently. I can't say what it is, but I had a composer reach out to me and say, hey, by the way, I'm using this thing for something. And I should give you thanks because this thing that I'm doing is actually because I was able to rescue a piece from a pitch on a project I didn't get that you got. And so now I'm using this music on this other thing and I'm actually really happy with it. And so in a way, thank you, which was a funny surprise, cool. Like years later.
All right, I have to run.
Yeah,
Thanks
me
for
too.
hanging out, everybody. There won't be an episode next week because I am going to the woods. I'm very excited about it. We'll see you in January.
Pulling a star.
Yep. Thanks for a wonderful 2023 to both of you and to everybody who listens to the show. We appreciate you. See you next year. Bye.
Cheers.